My brother sold our family business behind my back, so I took it away from him forever. They say blood is thicker than water, but let me tell you something. Greed is thicker than both. Picture this, my own brother, standing in the ruins of what we built together, realizing that the empire he thought he'd stolen was crumbling beneath his feet. The look of pure panic in his eyes when he understood that I hadn't just walked away. I had orchestrated his complete downfall. His hands were literally shaking as he stared at the foreclosure notice, knowing that everything he'd taken from me was slipping through his fingers like sand. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Welcome to Revenge Treats, where we serve up stories of ultimate payback. My name is Maria. I'm in my early 40s, and for 23 years, I believed that if I just worked hard enough at our family's construction business, if I just proved my worth day after day, sunrise to sunset, I'd finally get the respect and recognition I deserved from my older brother. I thought that loyalty, dedication, and pure grit would eventually break through the wall of sexism and favoritism that had defined my entire adult life. I couldn't have been more wrong. Before we dive into this tale of betrayal and sweet, sweet justice, let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that their betrayal left you questioning everything you thought you knew about family loyalty? Have you ever been the one doing all the work while someone else took all the credit? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and trust me, I've got time now. And if you're here for stories where justice is served ice cold, with a side of poetic irony, smash that like button and subscribe to Revenge. Treats for more satisfying tales of comeuppance. Let me paint you a picture of my life before everything went to hell, because understanding the depth of my sacrifice makes the betrayal that much more devastating. Our family business, Rodriguez Construction, wasn't just a company. It was our legacy. Our father's American dream made manifest in concrete and steel. Dad started Rodriguez Construction in 1975, with nothing but a beat-up pickup truck, a toolbox, held together with duct tape, and an immigrant's unshakable belief that hard work could overcome anything. He built that company from the ground up, one honest job at a time. When he passed away 15 years ago after a sudden heart attack, he left the business to both of us equally in his will. Me and my older brother, Tony. At least, that's what I thought at the time. From the very first day after Dad's funeral, I threw myself into that business like my life depended on it, because in many ways, it did. This wasn't just my job. It was my identity, my purpose, my connection to the father I'd lost too soon. While Tony handled what he called the big picture stuff, which meant schmoozing with clients over expensive lunches, playing golf at the country club, and attending networking events, I was the one in the trenches, fighting for every contract, managing every detail. Let me give you a sense of what my typical day looked like. I'd be on job sites at 5 a.m., coffee in one hand, and blueprints in the other, coordinating with subcontractors before the sun even thought about rising. I personally trained half our crew, not just in the technical skills, but in the Rodriguez way of doing business, with integrity, precision, and respect for the craft. I developed relationships with suppliers that saved us thousands of dollars, annually through loyalty discounts and preferred payment terms. When we needed specialty materials on short notice, they'd move heaven and earth for me, because I'd done the same for them countless times. The real turning point came when we landed that massive municipal contract to renovate the downtown courthouse, a $2.3 million job that would be our biggest contract ever. But here's the thing, that contract didn't just fall into our laps. I spent 4 months preparing that bid, working 18-hour days to get every detail perfect. I personally visited the site dozens of times, crawling through dusty basements and climbing into cramped attic spaces to understand exactly what we were dealing with. I researched the building's history, consulted with structural engineers, and even tracked down the original 1920s blueprints from the city archives. When other contractors were submitting generic inflated bids, I was presenting a detailed restoration plan that honored the building's historical significance while meeting Modern safety standards. I knew every pipe, every beam, every quirk of that century-old structure. The city council didn't just award us the contract. They praised our proposal as exemplary and exactly the kind of thoughtful approach this landmark deserves. Meanwhile, Tony would roll into the office around 10 a.m., usually smelling like expensive cologne and carrying a coffee that cost more than some of our workers made in an hour. He'd make a few phone calls, review some paperwork, and then disappear for business meetings that somehow always happened at the country club or fancy restaurants. Don't get me wrong, he was charismatic, good with people, excellent at being the face of the company. But the heart, the soul, the actual work that kept Rodriguez Construction running, that was all me. Our crew knew it too. When problems arose on job sites, they called me, not Tony. When clients had technical questions, they asked for Maria, not the owner. When we needed someone to work through the weekend to meet a deadline, I was there with my sleeves rolled up, right alongside the guys. I earned their respect through competence and reliability, something Tony never seemed to understand. But here's where the real injustice started eating at me. Our arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until we found our footing after Dad's death. Just until we get back on our feet, Tony had said at Dad's funeral, his hand on my shoulder as tears streamed down my face. Then we'll formalize everything properly. You'll be a full partner, not just in spirit, but on paper. Those words gave me hope during the darkest period of my life. I thought I was working toward something bigger than just a paycheck. I believed I was earning my rightful place as an equal partner in the business our father had built. Tony promised me that once the business stabilized, we'd restructure everything. I'd become a full partner with my name on the company registration, on the contracts, on everything that mattered. After all, I was already doing the work of a partner, managing projects, developing client relationships, making critical business decisions. I deserved the recognition and the security that came with it. But here's the thing about promises from manipulative people. They're always dangling just out of reach, like a carrot on a stick. Every time I brought up making our partnership official, Tony had an excuse ready. Let's wait until after this big project closes. The market's a bit uncertain right now, Maria. I want to make sure the timing is right for both of us. You know how complicated these legal things can be. 23 years of excuses, and I was fool enough to believe every single one. 23 years of next month, and after the holidays, and when things settle down. I was so focused on proving myself worthy of partnership that I never stopped to question why I needed to prove anything at all. Meanwhile, Tony lived like he owned the world, which, as it turned out, he did. New Mercedes every 2 years. Always. The latest model with all the bells and whistles. A house in the hills that looked like something out of Architectural Digest, complete with a pool, a 3-car garage, and a wine cellar that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Vacations to Europe with his wife Linda, sending postcards from Rome and Paris while I was lucky to get a long weekend at the local lake. The most galling part was how he'd act like he was doing me some enormous favor by allowing me to work myself to death for his benefit. Maria's the backbone of this operation, he'd tell clients and suppliers, always with that patronizing smile. I don't know what I'd do without her. He'd say it like I should be grateful for the acknowledgement, never seeming to realize that acknowledgement without compensation is just another form of exploitation. At company barbecues and holiday parties, Tony would regale everyone with stories of our successes, always positioning himself as the visionary leader while casting me as the reliable implementer. Maria's great with the details, he'd say, but I handle the big picture strategy. It was infuriating how he'd diminish my contributions while simultaneously taking credit for the results of my work. The sexism was subtle but constant. When I'd present ideas in meetings, Tony would nod politely and then build on my suggestions, rephrasing them in his own words until they sounded like his original thoughts. When clients complimented our work, he'd accept the praise graciously, without mentioning that I'd managed every aspect of the project. When industry publications wrote articles about Rodriguez Construction's success, the photos always featured Tony in his hard hat and suit, looking every inch the successful businessman, while I remained invisible. But I told myself it would all be worth it once we formalized our partnership. I convinced myself that Tony's behavior was just old-fashioned thinking, that he'd eventually recognize my value and make things right. I was patient because I believed in the promise of eventual equality. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. I was so busy working toward a future that existed only in my imagination that I never stopped to examine the reality of my situation. I was giving everything, my time, my expertise, my loyalty, my life, to someone who saw me as nothing more than a highly skilled employee who was too grateful and too trusting to demand what she was worth. The discovery that shattered my world happened on a Tuesday morning in March, one of those crisp spring days that should have felt full of possibility. I arrived at the office early, as always, carrying my usual large coffee and a box of donuts for the crew. The sun was just starting to paint the sky pink, and I was actually feeling optimistic about the day ahead. We'd just received final approval for a major commercial renovation project, and I was eager to start the planning phase. Tony's office door was slightly ajar, which was unusual for that early in the morning. He typically didn't arrive until well after 9 a.m., often claiming he'd been up late, strategizing, or networking. But there he was, speaking in hushed, urgent tones on his phone. Something about his posture, the way he was hunched over his desk, glancing repeatedly at the door, made me pause. I know eavesdropping isn't admirable, but something in his voice set off every alarm bell in my head. I pressed myself against the wall beside his door, my heart already starting to race, with a premonition of disaster. "Yeah, the buyer's ready to close next Friday," he was saying, his voice carrying that false confidence he used when he was trying to convince someone of something. "Everything's signed, sealed, and ready to deliver. The idiot has no idea what's coming." My blood turned to ice. The buyer? Tony was selling Rodriguez Construction, our family business. The company I'd poured my heart and soul into for over 2 decades. But who was the idiot he was referring to? Marcus? "She'll be fine," he continued, and I realized with growing horror that he was talking about me. "Girl's a worker bee, she'll find another hive. Besides, what's she gonna do? She's got no legal claim to anything. I made sure of that from the very beginning." The words hit me like a physical blow. Worker bee. No legal claim. Made sure of that from the beginning. Each phrase was a nail in the coffin of everything I'd believed about my life, my future, my family. I heard him laugh. Actually, laugh at something the person on the other end said, a sound so casual and cruel that it made my stomach lurch. "Trust me, by this time next week, I'll be sipping mojitos on a beach in the Bahamas, and Maria will be updating her resume on LinkedIn. The beauty of it is, she did all the hard work to make this place valuable enough to sell for top dollar. I should probably send her a thank you card." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. 23 years of my life, and he was joking about it like I was some intern who'd outlived her usefulness. I was shaking so hard I had to grip the wall to keep from collapsing. "The purchase price?" Tony continued. $4.2 million. Not bad for a business I inherited, right? And the best part is, all the key contracts are tied to the company name, not to any individual employees. Maria trained everyone, built all the relationships, did all the grunt work, but legally, it all belongs to Rodriguez Construction, which belongs to me. $4.2 million. Nearly 2.5 decades of my expertise, my relationships, my innovation, and my sacrifice was being sold for $4.2 million, and I wouldn't see a penny of it. But the conversation wasn't over. Tony's voice dropped even lower, taking on a conspiratorial tone that made my skin crawl. "Here's the really sweet part. I've got a 6-month non-compete clause ready for her to sign. Standard severance package stuff, you know? She signs it to get her final paycheck, and then she can't work in construction anywhere in the county for half a year. By the time she's legally allowed to compete, I'll be long gone, and the new owners will have solidified all the relationships. A non-compete clause. He was planning to not only steal my life's work, but to prevent me from using my skills and experience to build something new. It was diabolical in its thoroughness. "Don't worry about the crew," he was saying. "Most of them are loyal to the paycheck, not to her. The new owners will keep the good ones and dump the rest. It's just business, you know. Maria's too emotional about this stuff. She never understood that family business is still business first. Too emotional. After 23 years of bleeding for this company, of sacrificing my personal life, my health, my relationships for the good of Rodriguez Construction, I was too emotional." The conversation continued for another few minutes, but I'd heard enough. I stumbled back to my car on shaking legs, my mind reeling with the magnitude of the betrayal. This wasn't just about money or business ownership. This was about my entire adult life being built on a foundation of lies. Sitting in my car in the parking lot of the company I'd thought was partly mine, I pulled up the official business registration documents on my phone. Rodriguez Construction, LLC. Owner, Antonio Rodriguez. Solely proprietor. No partners listed. No shared ownership. Just Tony, as it had been for 23 years. Every promise had been a lie. Every "we're in this together," and "you're like a partner already," and "just be patient a little longer," had been manipulation designed to keep me working without demanding my fair share. I'd been living in a fantasy while Tony had been systematically positioning himself to discard me whenever it became convenient. The betrayal cut deeper than I can adequately describe. It wasn't just about the financial devastation, though, that was real. At 42, starting over with nothing, while Tony retired as a multimillionaire. It wasn't just about the professional humiliation, though that stung, being reduced from a respected industry expert to an unemployed former employee. Overnight. It was about the fundamental violation of everything I'd believed about family, loyalty, and fairness. My brother, the person I'd trusted most in the world after our father died, had been planning to discard me like yesterday's newspaper. Every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every moment of shared grief over Dad's death had been tainted by his secret knowledge that he was going to betray me. I thought about all the times I'd defended Tony to others in the industry who'd questioned his contributions. "Tony's the business mind," I'd say. "He sees the big picture while I handle the execution." I'd been his unwitting accomplice in maintaining the fiction that he was the indispensable leader, while I was merely the reliable worker. I thought about all the personal sacrifices I'd made for the company, relationships that had ended because I was always working, vacations I'd never taken because there was always another project that needed my attention, the house I'd never bought because I was living modestly, while reinvesting everything back into what I thought was our shared future. I thought about Dad, and how proud he'd been of both his children. How he'd specifically mentioned in conversations before his death that he wanted us to work together, to carry on the family legacy as a team. Tony hadn't just betrayed me. He'd betrayed Dad's memory and wishes. But perhaps most devastating of all was the realization of how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. Tony hadn't just passively failed to make me a partner. He'd actively prevented it while encouraging me to believe it was still possible. He'd used my loyalty, my work ethic, and my love for our father against me. Every time I'd brought up formalizing our partnership, he'd known it was never going to happen. But he'd strung me along with just enough hope to keep me working. I sat in that parking lot for over an hour, cycling through shock, rage, grief, and a growing sense of helplessness. How do you fight someone who holds all the legal cards? How do you recover from a betrayal so complete that it rewrites the entire history of your adult life? I confronted Tony that same afternoon, though it took me several hours to work up the courage. I'd spent the morning driving aimlessly around the city, trying to process what I'd learned and figure out how to handle it. Part of me hoped there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that would make this all make sense, but deep down, I knew better. When I finally walked into his office, my hands were shaking and my voice was barely under control. I closed the door behind me, took a deep breath, and laid it all out. I told him I'd heard the phone call, that I knew about the sale, and that I couldn't believe he would betray me like this after everything we'd been through together. His reaction told me everything I needed to know about the man I'd called my brother for 42 years. He didn't look ashamed, surprised, or even particularly concerned. Instead, he leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the one I'd helped him pick out 3 years earlier during our office renovation, and gave me the kind of patronizing smile you'd give to a child who'd just discovered that Santa Claus wasn't real. "Look, Maria," he said, his voice taking on that condescending tone he used when he thought he was being patient with my emotional responses. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but this is business. Dad left the company to me, and I've got to make the best decisions for my family's future." "What about my family?" I shot back, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "What about the 23 years I've put into this place? What about all your promises about making me a partner? What about Dad's wishes for us to work together?" Tony's expression hardened, and for the first time, I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I'd just chosen not to see it. "Promises? Come on, Maria. You're a smart woman. Did you really think I was going to hand over half of everything Dad built just because you showed up to work every day and did your job well? That's called being an employee, not being a partner." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This wasn't just betrayal. It was gaslighting on an industrial scale. He was rewriting history, making me feel foolish for believing in promises he'd made repeatedly, in front of witnesses, for over 2 decades. "I've already prepared a generous severance package for you," he continued, sliding a manila envelope across his mahogany desk like he was doing me some enormous favor. 8 months' salary, plus a bonus for your years of service. That's more than fair, especially considering you'll have time to find something new. 8 months' salary for 23 years of my life. For building the very success he was about to cash in on for over $4 million. The insulting inadequacy of it was almost laughable. "And Maria," Tony added, his voice dropping to something that sounded almost threatening, "I hope you'll be reasonable about this. I've included a standard non-compete agreement in your severance package. Nothing personal, just standard business practice to protect the company's interests during the transition." There it was, the trap I'd heard him discuss on the phone. The non-compete clause that would prevent me from using my skills and industry relationships to start over. "You're going to try to stop me from working in construction?" I asked, incredulous. "After stealing my life's work, you want to make sure I can't even use my experience to survive?" Tony shrugged, as if my career prospects were of no more concern to him than the weather. "It's just business, Maria. The new owners need to protect their investment. If you want to work in construction, maybe consider moving to a different county, or waiting out the 6 months. It's not personal." That phrase, "it's not personal," while discussing the destruction of my entire professional life, was perhaps the most infuriating thing he could have said. Of course it was personal. This was my family, my career, my future he was casually destroying. "And if you're thinking about making this difficult," Tony continued, his mask slipping to reveal something genuinely ugly underneath, "remember that I control everything here. The client relationships, the supplier contracts, the employee records, everything. You can walk away with dignity and your severance package, or you can try to fight this and walk away with nothing but a reputation that'll make sure you never work construction in this city again." The threat was clear and comprehensive. He'd spent 23 years positioning himself to hold all the cards while I'd been focused on actually doing the work. He controlled the relationships with clients because he'd been the face of the company at all the schmoozing events. He controlled the legal aspects because everything was in his name. He controlled the narrative because he was the official owner talking about a disgruntled employee. But there was something else in his threat that revealed just how calculated this betrayal had been. He wasn't just stealing the business and running. He was prepared to destroy my reputation if I didn't go quietly. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by a sudden opportunity. This was a long-term plan that had been in motion for months, maybe years. Why? I asked. And for the first time since entering his office, my voice cracked with genuine emotion. Why would you do this to me? I'm your sister, Tony. We grieved Dad together. We built this company together. How can you just throw all of that away? For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But it passed so quickly I might have imagined it. I'm not throwing anything away, he said firmly. I'm making a smart business decision that sets me up for retirement while I'm still young enough to enjoy it. You're talented, Maria. You'll land on your feet, but this company was never going to be big enough for both of us to retire comfortably. The selfishness of it was staggering. It had never occurred to him that we could have grown the business together, that my contributions made the company more valuable, not less. In his mind, success was a zero-sum game where his gain required my loss. I need an answer by Friday, he said, tapping the envelope with his finger. The sale closes next week, and the new owners want a clean transition. No loose ends, no disgruntled former employees causing problems. I stared at that envelope for a long moment, understanding that it represented more than just a severance package. It was Tony's final insult, asking me to sign away my right to compete in exchange for what amounted to pocket change compared to what he was stealing from me. I'll think about it, I said finally, taking the envelope not because I intended to sign anything, but because I needed to see exactly what kind of legal traps he'd prepared for me. As I turned to leave, Tony called out, Maria, I hope you understand that this isn't about you personally. You've been a great asset to this company, but business is business, and family is family. Sometimes you have to keep them separate. I stopped at the door and turned back to look at him. You know what, Tony? You're absolutely right. Business is business, and family is family. I'm glad you've made that distinction so clear. I walked out of his office that day, knowing that I was no longer his sister in any meaningful sense of the word. Family protects each other, supports each other, builds each other up. What Tony had done was purely transactional. He'd used my love and loyalty as tools to extract maximum value from me before discarding me. But I also walked out with something Tony didn't expect. A crystal clear understanding of exactly who I was dealing with, and the beginning of a plan that would turn his own methods against him. The weeks following my confrontation with Tony were the darkest period of my adult life. I'd taken his severance package. What choice did I have? I needed the money to survive while I figured out my next move. But that envelope of documents felt like blood money, a payoff for staying quiet about my own exploitation. I couldn't eat without feeling nauseous. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by waves of anger and grief that would wash over me at random moments. I'd catch myself driving past job sites I'd managed, seeing other crews working on projects I'd started, feeling like a ghost haunting her own former life. The courthouse renovation, my courthouse renovation, was still ongoing under the new management Tony had hastily put in place. Driving by one afternoon, I saw them installing windows incorrectly, using the wrong materials, cutting corners I would never have allowed. That building was a piece of history, a testament to craftsmanship from an era when things were built to last. Watching it being butchered by people who didn't understand or care about its significance felt like watching someone vandalize Dad's grave. My personal life, which had already been strained by decades of 60-hour work weeks, began to unravel completely. Friends who'd only known me in the context of Rodriguez construction didn't know how to relate to this broken, unemployed version of me. The few romantic relationships I'd attempted over the years had already ended because I was always working, always putting the business first. Now I had nothing but time and a devastating sense of purposelessness. My savings, which I'd kept modest because I'd always believed my security lay in my partnership stake, wouldn't last long. At 42, I was facing the prospect of starting over from scratch while Tony retired as a millionaire. The financial disparity was crushing, but the emotional devastation was worse. My wife, Elena, we'd married 5 years earlier, one of the few good decisions I'd made outside of work, watched me spiral with increasing alarm. Elena worked as a nurse, and she'd seen plenty of people hit rock bottom, but she'd never seen me like this. I'd always been the strong one, the problem solver, the person who could handle any crisis that came her way. "You need to do something," she finally said one evening, as I sat staring blankly at the television, not really watching, but using it as a distraction from my own thoughts. "This isn't just about Tony anymore, Maria. You're destroying yourself, and I'm watching the woman I married disappear." She was right. I was letting Tony's betrayal define me, letting him win twice, once by stealing my work, and again by stealing my sense of self-worth. But knowing she was right and finding the strength to act on that knowledge were two different things. The turning point came through an unexpected conversation with Carlos Mendoza, my old mentor and Dad's first employee. Carlos had been like a second father to me, teaching me everything from how to read blueprints to how to earn the respect of crews who weren't used to taking orders from women. He'd retired 5 years earlier, but we'd stayed in touch, and he'd always been someone I could count on for honest advice. I hadn't told him about Tony's betrayal. I was too ashamed, too embarrassed by my own naivety. But Carlos had worked in construction for over 40 years. He knew how to read people, and he could see I was struggling. "Mija," he said over coffee at our usual diner, his weathered hands wrapped around his mug. "You look like someone who's lost everything. But I know you, and I know that's not possible. So tell me what's really going on." The whole story came pouring out. 23 years of false promises, the secret sale, the non-compete clause, the casual cruelty of Tony's dismissal. Carlos listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee like he could see the future in the steam rising from it. "Your father," he finally said, "didn't just leave Tony a business. He left him the clients, the reputation, the Rodriguez name, everything your family built over decades. But here's what Tony doesn't understand, Mija. A name is just a name. The real value, the actual skill, the relationships with the people who do the work, that walked out the door with you." Something about the way he said it made me look up from my own misery for the first time in weeks. "You trained half our crew yourself," Carlos continued. "You built relationships with suppliers based on trust and competence, not just company, letterhead. You know every client's preferences, every project's quirks, every trick of the trade that makes Rodriguez construction actually successful. Tony might own the business on paper, but you are the business in every way that matters." As he spoke, I felt something stirring in me that I hadn't felt since that devastating Tuesday morning. Hope mixed with something harder and more focused. Not just hope for my own recovery, but the beginning of an idea that would turn Tony's betrayal into his downfall. "But Carlos," I said, "the non-compete clause," he waved his hand dismissively. "Non-compete clauses are only as strong as the person trying to enforce them. And they only apply if you're actually competing with the same business. What if there was no business left to compete with?" That night, I sat down with Elena and laid out the beginning of a plan. It wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, about proving that competence and relationships matter more than legal documents and family names. "Tony thinks he's selling a thriving business," I told Elena, spreading paperwork across our kitchen table. "But what if, by the time the sale closes, there's no business left to sell?" Elena, bless her, didn't try to talk me out of it. Instead, she pulled up a chair and asked, "What do you need me to do?" Over the next several days, I began making phone calls, not to sabotage or destroy, but to exercise the relationships and loyalty I'd built over 2 decades of honest work and fair treatment. First, I called our key employees. Carlos Jr., our best foreman, and Carlos Sr.'s son, who'd learned the trade under my guidance. Miguel Santos, who ran our electrical crew and had started as an apprentice when I first joined the company. Sophie Chen, our project manager who'd started as my assistant and worked her way up through competence and dedication. Rosa Martinez, our office manager who kept track of every detail and knew where every body was buried, figuratively speaking. One by one, I reached out to people I'd trained, people I'd worked alongside for years, people who'd seen me solve problems and meet deadlines and maintain standards even when it would have been easier to cut corners. The response was immediate and unanimous. "Where you go, we go, Maria." Not because I asked them to betray Tony, but because they'd been waiting for someone to give them an alternative. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been feeling undervalued and taken for granted. Tony's management style, when he bothered to manage it all, was all carrot and no stick, lots of promises and very little follow-through. He'd been coasting on the momentum I'd built for years, and the people doing the actual work had noticed. Then I started calling our suppliers. The lumberyard owner, Jim Patterson, who'd given us preferred pricing for over a decade, because I'd personally helped him through a cash flow crisis years earlier by advocating for extended payment terms with other contractors. The concrete supplier, Maria Vasquez, who trusted my word over any written contract, because I'd never failed to pay on time or tried to shortchange her on quantities. The specialty contractors, the roofers, the HVAC specialists, the flooring experts, who'd work with us on short notice because I'd always given them fair contracts and referred business their way. Same response across the board. Their loyalty was to me, not to the Rodriguez construction name on the checks. Finally, I started researching Tony's buyer, this hotshot developer from out of state. His name was Richard Blackstone, and he specialized in what the industry politely called optimization, buying established construction companies, stripping out the valuable contracts and relationships, and either flipping them quickly or running them into the ground while extracting maximum short-term profit. Blackstone had a pattern. He'd buy a company based on its current contracts and client relationships, then immediately start cutting costs by replacing experienced workers with cheaper alternatives, reducing quality standards, and squeezing suppliers for better terms. Most of the companies he'd acquired were either resold within 2 years or dissolved entirely, leaving behind a trail of unfinished projects and angry clients. Tony wasn't just selling to someone who would continue Dad's legacy. He was selling to someone who would destroy it for parts. Whether he knew it or not, he was betraying Dad's memory as completely as he'd betrayed me. That's when my plan crystallized into something beautiful and terrible and absolutely fair. Tony thought he was selling a thriving business built on the Rodriguez name and reputation. But what if, by the time Blackstone took over, he discovered that the Rodriguez name was just an empty shell, and all the actual value had walked away with the woman Tony had dismissed as too emotional? While I was quietly orchestrating what would become Tony's downfall, he was living his best life, completely oblivious to the storm gathering around him. In fact, his arrogance and complacency during this period made what happened next not just inevitable, but poetic. Tony had already put a down payment on a beachfront condo in Key West. Not just any condo, but a luxury penthouse with panoramic ocean views that cost more than most people make in a lifetime. He'd been showing off the listing photos to anyone who'd listen, bragging about his brilliant business move and his plans for early retirement. Sometimes you've got to make the tough decisions, I heard he'd told people at the country club, according to mutual acquaintances who couldn't wait to share the gossip. Maria's a good worker, don't get me wrong, but she doesn't have the vision for the big picture. This sale sets both of us up for the future. She gets a generous severance to start fresh, and I get to enjoy the fruits of all my hard work. The rewriting of history was breathtaking. In Tony's version of events, he was the visionary entrepreneur, making smart strategic decisions, while I was the loyal employee who'd been fairly compensated for my contributions. He'd completely erased 23 years of promises, 23 years of we're partners in everything but paperwork, 23 years of leading me to believe I was building towards something that belonged to both of us. But Tony's narcissism worked in my favor. He was so confident in his position, so convinced of his own brilliance, that he didn't notice the warning signs that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. When Carlos Jr. put in his 2 weeks' notice, Tony barely looked up from his golf magazine. "He'll be back," Tony told his secretary Linda. "Good foremen are hard to find, and nobody else is going to pay him what we do." Except Carlos Jr. wasn't just any foreman. He was the guy who could look at a job site and instantly spot potential problems that would cost thousands to fix later. His knowledge was institutional, passed down from his father and refined through years of working directly under my supervision. When Miguel's electrical crew started showing up late and doing increasingly sloppy work, Tony attributed it to post-transition blues and assumed they'd get their act together once the new owners took over. He didn't realize that Miguel had been my right-hand man for electrical work for over 15 years, and that his crew's declining performance was directly proportional to their declining loyalty to a boss who barely knew their names. When Sophie Chen, our project manager, submitted her resignation, Tony was genuinely surprised. "I thought she was happy here," he told Linda, apparently having never noticed that Sophie had been handling increasingly complex responsibilities without corresponding increases in authority or compensation. Sophie had been doing the work of a senior partner while being paid like a mid-level employee, and Tony had been too focused on his exit strategy to realize how valuable she'd become. Most telling of all was Tony's reaction when 3 major suppliers suddenly demanded payment up front instead of extending the usual credit terms we'd enjoyed for years. Instead of recognizing this as a red flag about his relationships with key business partners, Tony assumed it was just market conditions or corporate policy changes. He authorized the prepayments without question, never wondering why companies that had trusted Rodriguez Construction's credit for over a decade were suddenly demanding cash on delivery. The truth was that Jim Patterson at the lumber yard, Maria Vasquez at the concrete company, and our other key suppliers had been extending those favorable terms based on their relationships with me, not with Rodriguez Construction as an entity. When I quietly mentioned to them that I'd be starting my own company soon, they began distancing themselves from Tony's business to avoid any conflicts of interest. It was completely ethical. They weren't refusing to work with Tony, just adjusting their terms to reflect the actual risk of dealing with a company that was losing its operational expertise. But Tony interpreted every one of these warning signs as minor bumps in an otherwise smooth transition. His buyer, Richard Blackstone, was scheduled to arrive in town the following week for a final walkthrough before closing, and Tony was confident everything would go perfectly. "Blackstone's going to be impressed," Tony told Linda, apparently needing someone to validate his decision since I was no longer around to nod along with his pronouncements. "Revenue's solid, contracts are in place, and the crew knows what they're doing. This is going to be the easiest acquisition he's ever made." Meanwhile, Tony had started making increasingly grandiose plans for his post-sale life. In addition to the Key West condo, he'd been looking at boats. Not just any boats, but luxury yachts that cost more per month in maintenance than most people's salaries. He'd even started talking about writing a book about his entrepreneurial journey, apparently believing that his story of inheriting a successful business and then selling it made him some kind of business guru. The most infuriating part was how he'd begun positioning himself as a generous older brother who'd set his sister up for success. At a family barbecue, the last one I attended before cutting contact with that side of the family, Tony actually had the audacity to tell our cousins that he'd taken care of Maria with a substantial severance package that would give her time to find her true calling. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for family is give them a push toward their destiny," he said, raising his beer like he was toasting his own magnanimity. "Maria's got great skills, but she was getting too comfortable in the same role. This will force her to spread her wings and discover what she's really capable of." The casual rewriting of my termination as some kind of favor he was doing me was almost more insulting than the original betrayal. In Tony's mind, he wasn't the villain who'd stolen his sister's life work. He was the wise mentor giving her a chance to grow. But his arrogance was about to become his downfall, because while Tony was celebrating his business genius and planning his retirement lifestyle, I was systematically dismantling everything that made Rodriguez Construction valuable. The beauty of my plan wasn't in its complexity. It was in its elegant simplicity. I didn't need to sabotage anything or break any laws. I didn't need to steal clients or badmouth Tony to suppliers. I just needed to exercise the relationships and loyalty I'd built over 2 decades of competent, ethical work. Phase 1 was establishing my own company, M. Rodriguez Construction Services. The name was similar enough to be recognizable but legally distinct enough to avoid any trademark issues. More importantly, the M stood for both Maria and Mom, a tribute to our mother, Rosa, who'd worked alongside Dad in the early days and whose contributions to the family business had also been largely overlooked by history. But I didn't just start a construction company. I created something Tony never could have imagined. Instead of the traditional owner-employee structure that had kept me trapped for 23 years, I established Monsieur Rodriguez Construction as a worker-owned cooperative. Every key employee who joined me became a part owner with equity stakes and profit-sharing agreements based on their contributions and seniority. Carlos Jr. didn't just become my foreman. He became a founding partner with a 15% stake in the company. Miguel's electrical crew didn't just change employers. They became the electrical division of a company they partially owned. Sophie wasn't just changing jobs. She was becoming the operations director of a business where her expertise and judgment would finally be valued appropriately. The psychological impact of this approach was immediate and powerful. These weren't just employees jumping ship for better pay. These were skilled professionals finally getting the recognition and security they'd earned through years of excellent work. The contrast with Tony's traditional, I own everything, you work for me model couldn't have been more stark. Within 3 weeks of my first phone calls, I'd hired away every single key employee from Rodriguez Construction. Not just the workers, the project managers, the supervisors, the skilled craftsmen who actually knew how to get things done. More importantly, I'd given them something Tony never had, a real stake in their own success. But the defections weren't random or chaotic. I'd planned the timing carefully to maximize the impact on Tony's business while minimizing disruption to ongoing projects. I wanted to cripple his company, not harm innocent clients who'd trusted Rodriguez Construction to complete their work. The exodus began on a Monday morning in early April. Carlos Jr. was the first to give his notice, walking into Tony's office with a calm professionalism that I'd taught him years earlier. According to Rosa Martinez, who'd stayed behind temporarily to help with the transition while feeding me intelligence about Tony's reactions, Tony's response was predictably dismissive. "He'll be back in a month," Tony told Rosa after Carlos left. "Small operations can't match our benefits package." By Wednesday, when Miguel and his entire electrical crew had submitted their resignations, Tony was starting to look concerned. By Friday, when Sophie turned in her notice along with 3 other project managers, he was beginning to panic. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded of Rosa, as if she could explain why his employees were abandoning a sinking ship. Did Maria put them up to this? Rosa, bless her heart, played innocent perfectly. "I don't know, Mr. Rodriguez. People have been talking about starting their own businesses, wanting more control over their careers. Maybe they just see an opportunity." Tony's next move was entirely predictable. He tried to counter-offer his way out of the problem. He called Carlos Jr. and offered him a 20% raise and a promotion to site supervisor. Carlos politely declined, explaining that he'd already committed to a partnership opportunity that offered both better compensation and equity ownership. Tony tried the same approach with Miguel, Sophie, and the others. In each case, the answer was the same. They appreciated the offer, but they'd found something better. Something that valued their contributions as more than just labor to be purchased. Meanwhile, my relationships with our suppliers were paying dividends in ways Tony couldn't have anticipated. When Rodriguez Construction suddenly needed to replace an entire crew's worth of expertise, they found themselves dealing with supply shortages and scheduling conflicts that seemed to multiply by the day. Jim Patterson at the lumber yard wasn't refusing to work with Tony. He was just prioritizing orders from companies that paid cash up front and had established relationships with his staff. Maria Vasquez at the concrete company wasn't sabotaging Tony's projects. She was just scheduling deliveries based on payment terms and order volume, which happened to favor companies with better credit relationships. The specialty contractors who'd worked with us for years, the roofers, HVAC specialists, flooring experts, weren't boycotting Rodriguez Construction, but they were naturally gravitating toward projects where they knew the management team and trusted the quality standards. Within a month, Tony's company was dealing with systematic delays, cost overruns, and quality control issues that would have been unthinkable during my tenure. The new workers he'd hastily hired to replace my team were competent enough for basic tasks, but they lacked the institutional knowledge and supplier relationships that had made Rodriguez Construction efficient and profitable. But the real masterstroke came from leveraging my knowledge of our existing contracts. Remember that municipal courthouse renovation? The $2.3 million project that I'd spent 4 months preparing the bid for? The contract that was making Tony's company look so attractive to Richard Blackstone? Well, municipal contracts have very specific clauses about key personnel and project continuity. When the city discovered that the project manager, site supervisor, and lead contractors on their biggest job had all left Rodriguez Construction, they had not just the right, but the obligation to review the contract terms. I didn't contact the city directly. That would have been unethical and possibly illegal. But I did make sure that my former colleagues understood their professional obligations. When Carlos Jr. left, he properly notified the city that he was no longer associated with the courthouse project. When Sophie left, she filed the required paperwork, indicating that project management responsibilities were being transferred. When Miguel's crew departed, the electrical subcontractor permits had to be updated to reflect the personnel changes. Each of these notifications was completely proper and legally required, but collectively, they painted a picture of a construction company losing its core competencies right in the middle of its most important project. The city's response was swift and devastating. They exercised their right to conduct a project review, sending inspectors to examine work that had been completed and assess the company's ability to finish the job with its remaining resources. What they found was a disaster in progress. Quality control issues that Carlos Jr. would have caught and corrected immediately had gone unnoticed for weeks. Electrical work that didn't meet code standards because Tony's replacement crew wasn't familiar with the courthouse's unique historical requirements. Material substitutions that saved money but violated the restoration guidelines that the City Council had specifically mandated. Within 2 weeks of the inspection, Rodriguez Construction received a formal notice of contract termination for cause. Not only was Tony losing a $2.3 million project, but he was facing potential penalties for substandard work and project delays. The domino effect was immediate and catastrophic. Without the courthouse contract, Tony's cash flow dried up overnight. Without experienced workers, his other projects started experiencing the same quality and scheduling problems. Without his usual credit terms from suppliers, he couldn't afford to bid competitively on new work to replace the revenue he was losing. Meanwhile, Monsieur Rodriguez Construction Services was landing contract after contract. It turns out that clients cared far more about the actual quality of work than they did about company names or fancy offices. When the people they'd learned to trust moved to a new company, the clients followed. The courthouse project was particularly satisfying. When the city terminated Tony's contract, they needed a replacement contractor who could complete the restoration according to the original specifications. Who better than the woman who'd written those specifications in the first place? M. Rodriguez. Construction Services won the courthouse contract in a competitive rebid process, not because of any favoritism or insider knowledge, but because we submitted a proposal that demonstrated superior understanding of the project requirements and proved we had the personnel and expertise to complete the work properly. When I walked through that courthouse for the first time as the official project manager, not Tony's unnamed sister, but Maria Rodriguez, owner and operator of her own construction company, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond simple revenge. This was justice. This was proving that competence and integrity matter more than legal ownership or family connections. The final blow to Tony's empire came from the most unexpected source, Richard Blackstone himself. When Blackstone arrived in town for his final due diligence review the week before the scheduled closing, he discovered that Rodriguez Construction had transformed from a thriving business into a hollow shell in the span of 6 weeks. The company had lost 80% of its skilled workforce, its biggest contract, and most of its supplier relationships. The few remaining employees were either inexperienced newcomers or long-term workers who were clearly planning their own exits. The office felt like a ghost town, with empty desks and a palpable sense of abandonment. But the real shock came when Blackstone started making calls to verify the client relationships that were supposed to transfer with the sale. One by one, he discovered that the clients weren't loyal to Rodriguez Construction as a company. They were loyal to the expertise and service quality that had walked out the door with me. "This isn't what we agreed to purchase," Blackstone told Tony during what I later learned was a very heated phone conversation. "You represented this as an ongoing concern with established client relationships and operational continuity. What you're trying to sell me is a company name and some office furniture." Tony's response, according to Rosa, who overheard parts of the conversation, was to blame me for sabotaging his business out of spite. But Blackstone was the experienced acquirer who'd seen this pattern before. Companies that looked successful on paper, but were actually dependent on key individuals who weren't properly incentivized to stay. "This is exactly why we do due diligence," Blackstone reportedly told Tony. "If your entire operation was dependent on one person, and you alienated that person badly enough that she took your whole team with her, then you weren't selling a business, you were selling a fantasy." The sale fell through on a Friday afternoon, in late April. I was on the courthouse job site, reviewing restoration work on the building's century-old carved stone facades, when Rosa called to tell me the news. "He's been locked in his office all day," she told me, her voice barely containing her excitement. "I think he might be crying. He keeps calling his lawyer and his accountant and anyone else who might be able to fix this somehow." But there was nothing to fix, because nothing had been broken illegally or unethically. I'd simply exercised my right to compete in a free market, using the skills, relationships, and reputation I'd earned through decades of honest work. Tony had gambled that he could take credit for my contributions while discarding me personally, and he'd lost everything. That was 3 years ago, and the transformation in both our lives has been nothing short of remarkable, though in very different directions. Today, Monsieur Rodriguez Construction Services is not only the premier construction company in our city, but we've expanded into 3 surrounding counties and are being courted for projects as far away as the state capital. We've completed the courthouse renovation. It won a State Historical Preservation Award and has become a model for similar restoration projects across the region. We're booked solid for the next 2 years, with a waiting list of clients who specifically request our services. But more importantly than the business success is what we've built culturally. My former employees aren't just employees anymore. They're partners, shareholders, people with a real stake in our collective success. Carlos Jr. just used his profit-sharing bonus to put a down payment on his first house, a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch that he's already planning to renovate using techniques we've perfected together. Sophie is heading up our new commercial division and has been invited to speak at industry conferences about innovative project management approaches. Miguel's electrical crew has expanded to 15 people, and he's started an apprenticeship program that's become a model for other trades in the region. The worker-owned cooperative structure has proven to be more than just ethically satisfying. It's been a competitive advantage. When everyone has skin in the game, when everyone benefits from efficiency and quality, the entire operation runs smoother than traditional top-down companies. Our employees don't just show up for paychecks. They show up as invested partners who take pride in every project. We've also pioneered some industry innovations that have drawn attention from across the construction world. Our profit-sharing model has been featured in trade publications as an example of how to retain skilled workers in an increasingly competitive market. Our focus on historical restoration has led to partnerships with preservation societies and tourism boards who see our work as economic development, not just construction. But perhaps most satisfying is the respect I've earned in an industry that hasn't always been welcoming to women. I'm no longer Tony's sister who does good work. I'm Maria Rodriguez, the owner-operator of a company that's known for taking on challenging projects that other contractors won't touch. When other construction companies face complex technical problems, they call us for consulting. When clients need work done right the first time, on schedule and under budget, they call us first. The courthouse project opened doors that I never could have imagined. Historical societies from across the state have contracted with us for restoration work on everything from Victorian mansions to Depression-era public buildings. We've restored a 1920s movie theater that's now the centerpiece of a downtown revitalization project, renovated a WPA-era school that's been converted into affordable housing, and rebuilt a 19th century bridge that was considered unsalvageable by 3 other contractors. Each project has built our reputation and expanded our capabilities. We're not just a construction company anymore. We're craftspeople, historians, problem solvers who specialize in bringing the past into conversation with the present. As for Tony, well, his trajectory has been the mirror image of mine. Rodriguez. Construction technically still exists, but it's a shadow of what it once was. He operates out of a small strip mall office with a part-time secretary and maybe 4 guys who show up when work is available. The projects he takes on now are small residential jobs, bathroom renovations, deck repairs, minor remodeling work, the kind of entry-level construction I was doing 25 years ago. The financial impact has been devastating but predictable. Tony had to sell his dream house to avoid bankruptcy, and even then he barely managed to avoid personal financial ruin. The Mercedes got repossessed when he couldn't make the payments after the Blackstone deal fell through. The Key West condo became a fantasy that evaporated along with his retirement dreams, but the social consequences might have been even worse for someone as image-conscious as Tony. At the country club where he used to hold court about his business acumen, he's become something of a cautionary tale. The guy who had everything handed to him and still managed to blow it through arrogance and poor judgment. The networking events and golf partnerships that used to feed his ego now serve as reminders of how far he's fallen. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Tony's marriage has been severely strained by the financial stress and his obvious depression about losing the business. His wife Linda, who'd grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle, has had to go back to work for the first time in 15 years. They've had to downsize from their mansion to a modest townhouse, trade European vacations for local camping trips, and generally adjust to a middle-class lifestyle that Tony seems to find personally humiliating. But here's the thing, I don't take joy in his downfall anymore. The anger that sustained me through those first months has been replaced by something more complex, pity mixed with a kind of exhausted disappointment. Tony didn't just lose a business. He lost the opportunity to be part of something bigger than himself, something that honored our father's legacy while building toward a better future. The most telling moment came about 18 months ago, when Tony showed up at one of my job sites, not to cause trouble, just to talk. I was overseeing the restoration of a 1930s Art Deco office building, working with a team of specialists to recreate the original decorative plasterwork that had been damaged by decades of neglect. Tony looked older than his years, worn down by stress and disappointment. His clothes were clean, but showed signs of wear, and he was driving a 10-year-old pickup truck that had seen better days. The contrast with the successful, confident man who'd dismissed me from his office 2 years earlier was striking. "I underestimated you," he said simply, watching my crew work with the kind of precision and care that had become our signature. "I thought you needed the Rodriguez name more than the Rodriguez name needed you." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of reality. We could have built something amazing together, I told him, meaning it. But you chose to see me as competition instead of as a partner. He nodded, staring at the ground with the posture of someone who'd replayed his mistakes 1,000 times. I know that now. I couldn't see past my own ego, I guess. Dad always said the business was big enough for both of us, but I never believed him. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the love I'd once had for my big brother, the person who'd taught me to throw a baseball and helped me with my homework and stood by my side at Dad's funeral. But that person had made choices that led us to this moment, standing on opposite sides of a chasm that couldn't be bridged with late regrets. The worst part, Tony continued, is that I destroyed everything Dad built, the Rodriguez name used, to mean something in this industry. Now it's just nothing. He was right about that, but not in the way he thought. The Rodriguez name still meant something. It just belonged to Monsieur Rodriguez Construction Services now, carrying forward the values of quality and integrity that Dad had instilled in both of us, even if only one of us had remembered them when it mattered. Dad's legacy isn't the company name, I told Tony. It's the way we treat people, the quality of our work, the relationships we build. That legacy is alive and well. It just moved to a place where it's properly valued. We talked for a few more minutes, but there wasn't much else to say. Tony wasn't asking for forgiveness or proposing some kind of reconciliation. He was just acknowledging the magnitude of his mistake and perhaps trying to understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly. As he turned to leave, Tony looked back at the building we were restoring, then at me. You always were the better, Rodriguez, he said quietly. I just never wanted to admit it. Looking back on this whole experience now, 3 years later, I realized that Tony actually did me an enormous favor, though that certainly wasn't his intention. His betrayal forced me to confront some hard truths about my own worth and to stop waiting for someone else's permission to claim what I'd earned. For 23 years, I'd been operating under the assumption that loyalty and hard work would eventually be rewarded by the people in power. I'd been waiting for Tony to recognize my contributions and voluntarily share the success we'd built together. But the truth is, power is rarely given. It's taken by people who have the courage and competence to seize opportunities when they arise. Tony's betrayal taught me that I didn't need his validation or his partnership to succeed. I had the skills, the relationships, and the expertise to build something even better than what we'd had together. His attempt to discard me like an unwanted employee forced me to discover my own strength and value in ways I might never have found otherwise. I learned that real power doesn't come from controlling other people or manipulating legal documents. It comes from earning genuine respect and loyalty through consistent excellence and ethical behavior. The relationships I'd built over 2 decades weren't with Rodriguez Construction as a company. They were with me as a professional who delivered on her promises and treated people fairly. Most importantly, I learned that the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about building something so much better that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. Tony thought he was discarding dead weight when he sold the company without me. Instead, he was freeing me to create something that would make his original business look small and petty by comparison. The worker-owned cooperative model we've built at M. Rodriguez Construction Services has become a case study in how to create sustainable, ethical businesses that benefit everyone involved. We've proven that treating workers as partners rather than costs creates better outcomes for clients, employees, and owners alike. Our success has inspired other construction companies to adopt similar models, and I regularly speak at industry conferences about the practical benefits of worker ownership. But beyond the business success, I've found something even more valuable. A sense of purpose and pride that I never had when I was working for someone else's dream. Every project we complete, every award we win, every employee who uses their profit-sharing bonus to improve their family's life, it all belongs to us collectively in ways that traditional ownership never could have provided. The courthouse restoration project has become a symbol of what's possible when skilled craftspeople are given the resources and respect they deserve to do their best work. That building will stand for another century, a testament to the quality that emerges when people take genuine pride in their contributions, rather than just collecting paychecks. Elena often jokes that the betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to our marriage because I finally came home energized and excited about my work instead of frustrated and exhausted by office politics. When you own your own success, when you're building towards something meaningful, work becomes a source of satisfaction rather than stress. And that's how I served my brother a dish he never saw coming. A mirror that showed him exactly what he'd thrown away when he chose greed over partnership. Sometimes the sweetest treat is watching someone realize they've played themselves out of the very success they thought they were protecting. But here's the really beautiful part. I didn't have to destroy Tony to build my own success. I just had to be better than him at the things that actually matter. Treating people fairly, delivering quality work, building relationships based on trust rather than manipulation. In the end, his downfall was entirely self-inflicted. I just provided an alternative that highlighted how hollow his version of success really was. Tony had everything he needed to build a dynasty that would have honored our father's memory and provided security for both our families. He had a skilled partner who was willing to do the work, loyal employees who believed in the company's mission, and client relationships built on decades of quality service. All he had to do was share the success fairly and treat people with basic respect. Instead, he chose to see business as a zero-sum game where his success required someone else's failure. He prioritized short-term personal gain over long-term sustainability, and he mistook legal ownership for actual control. In the end, he learned the hard way that you can't own what you haven't earned, and you can't control what you don't understand. The most satisfying part isn't that Tony failed, it's that everyone who bet on competence and integrity over politics and manipulation has been rewarded. Carlos Jr., Miguel, Sophie, Rosa, and all the others who took a risk on my new company are now partners in something bigger and better than what they left behind. They're not just employees collecting paychecks, they're owners building wealth and taking pride in work that reflects their values. What did you think of this serving of revenge? Would you have done anything differently? Or do you have a story where you had to cook up your own revenge treat after being betrayed by someone you trusted? Have you ever been in a situation where your hard work and loyalty were taken for granted by people who should have valued them? I'd love to hear about times when you had to stand up for your own worth, especially if you're a woman in a male-dominated industry who's had to prove herself over and over again. Or maybe you've been part of a family business where favoritism and politics overshadowed actual contributions. Dish it out in the comments below. I read them all, and I love hearing from people who've had to fight for the respect they deserved. If you enjoyed this story and are hungry for more tales where the bill always comes due, where hard work and integrity triumph over manipulation and greed, make sure to devour that like button, subscribe to Revenge Treats, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next serving. Thanks for joining us at Revenge Treats, where payback is always on the menu, and sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply being so much better at what you do that the people who underestimated you can't help but notice. Until next time, remember, the best treat is the one you earn yourself.